Pedro had always been the kind of man many would consider accomplished. At 44, he was the director of a multinational company, wore tailored suits, and lived in a 3-story house in a gated community where the parked cars looked like they belonged at an auto show. He had 2 young children enrolled in the best school in town, an elegant wife, dinners at award-winning restaurants, and frequent trips to destinations most only saw in magazines. Yet every year, on his birthday, when the room filled with smiles, birthday wishes, and clinking glasses, Pedro felt something no one else could perceive, a deafening silence within his chest, an invisible hole that neither champagne nor expensive gifts could fill. When he blew out the candles, his wish was always the same, though never shared with anyone. Lord, give me the real gift, the one I don't even know exists. The morning after his 45th birthday, Pedro woke up more restless than usual. The mirror showed him a handsome, clean-shaven face with clear eyes and flawless hair, but something felt out of place. Without telling anyone, he grabbed his car keys and started driving aimlessly. He stopped in front of a city park he barely remembered the last time he had visited. He parked the luxury car under the shade of a tree and walked along the dirt path, feeling the grass meet the expensive soles of his shoes. The sky was clear. The air smelled of damp earth, and for a moment, the silence around him seemed to speak, louder than the eloquent speeches he often heard in company meetings. That's when he saw, sitting on a wooden bench, a homeless man. Simple clothes, a serene face, eyes closed as if listening to some invisible melody. Pedro stopped, watching. Strangely, he felt drawn to that man. Perfeito. Vou começar a tradução da história de Pedro e o mendigo agora, fielmente e sem pausas, como sempre fazemos. Pedro had always been the kind of man many would consider accomplished. At 44 years old, he was the director of a multinational company, wore tailored suits, and lived in a 3-story house in a gated community where the parked cars looked like they came out of an auto show. He had 2 young children attending the best school in the city, an elegant wife, dinners in award-winning restaurants, and frequent trips to destinations most people only saw in magazines. And yet, every year, on his birthday, when the living room was filled with smiles, birthday wishes, and clinking glasses, Pedro felt something that no one else could notice, a deafening silence inside his chest, an invisible hole that no champagne or expensive gift could fill. When blowing out the candles, his wish was always the same, though never shared with anyone. Lord, give me the real gift, the one I don't even know I'm missing. The morning after his 45th birthday, Pedro woke up more restless than usual. The mirror returned a handsome face, clean-shaven, with clear eyes and impeccable hair. But something in it felt out of place. Without telling anyone, he grabbed his car keys and drove off with no destination. He stopped in front of a municipal park he could barely remember the last time he visited. He parked his luxury car under the shade of a tree and walked down a dirt path, feeling the grass mix with the soles of his expensive shoes. The sky was clear, the air smelled of damp earth, and for a moment, the silence around him spoke louder than the eloquent speeches he heard in company meetings. That's when he saw, sitting on a wooden bench, a homeless man. Simple clothes, serene face, eyes closed as if listening to an invisible melody. Pedro stopped and stared. He felt strangely drawn to that man. Driven by a mix of curiosity and vanity, Pedro approached. He wanted to understand what it was about that unassuming figure that exuded such peace. He greeted him with a wave and, in a tone louder than necessary, said something about the weather and the birds, trying to sound friendly, but also superior. The man slowly opened his eyes, looked into Pedro's, and smiled tenderly. Thinking himself generous, Pedro asked if he needed anything: money, food, a coat. But what he heard in response didn't fit into any of the predictable categories he had imagined. "To ask for more than I already have would be selfish," the man replied calmly. "I have what matters." Pedro was speechless. That phrase completely disarmed him, as if someone had pulled the ground from beneath him with a simple whisper. Without giving Pedro a chance to respond, the man began to speak, and his words didn't come as complaints from someone suffering, but as memories wrapped in gratitude. He spoke of his parents, who, despite being poor, had taught him to be thankful for every meal, for every sunset. He talked about his beloved wife, with whom he had lived years of tenderness before losing her to a swift and cruel illness, and how, even so, he smiled when he remembered the way she used to brush her hair. He mentioned the day he shared a piece of bread with a hungry child, and how, upon seeing the child's smile, he felt more satisfied than at any banquet. And with discreet tears in his eyes, he confided that his greatest treasure was sitting on that bench, watching the birds dance in the sky. "Happiness isn't found in what we accumulate, but in what we notice," he said, as if revealing an eternal secret. Pedro, who at first thought he had something to teach, began listening like a student before a silent master. He felt ashamed of the words he had prepared, the money he thought to offer, the possessions he used as a shield against his own emptiness. That man, homeless, without a car, without power, was showing him a freedom he had never known. A light breeze passed through the trees, and Pedro closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the bench was empty. The man had vanished as if he had dissolved into thin air, without noise, without farewell. Pedro looked around, walked a few steps, searched, but there was no one. He stood there, motionless, heart stumbling, as if waking from a dream that in truth had been the reality he had always been trying to see. Pedro returned home in silence, driving slowly as if carrying something too fragile for haste. The car felt like a tight cocoon, and for the first time he realized how little joy that leather steering wheel now brought him. When he arrived home, his children ran to hug him, and instead of responding with his usual distracted smile, Pedro knelt, held them in a long embrace, and cried. It wasn't a cry of pain, but of revelation, like someone finally understanding what had always been in front of him. In the following days, he cancelled meetings, postponed commitments, and began to do something he had never done before: observe. He noticed how his wife adjusted the pictures on the wall, how his children played with the sunlight pouring through the window, how the birds from the park also flew above his own garden. Something inside him had changed, though the world outside remained the same. Over time, with the gentleness of someone learning to relearn, Pedro began to transform his actions. He developed the habit of visiting shelters and listening to stories he once would have deemed unworthy of attention. He learned to give without feeling like a hero for it. He rediscovered the faith he had buried beneath spreadsheets and profits, and he began to see God in the simplest of details. On Sundays, he stopped attending luxurious brunches and started bringing hot coffee to those sleeping on sidewalks. The park where he met the man became a fixed stop in his routine, as if he were silently hoping he would return one day. And even though he never saw the man again, that empty bench became an altar, a reminder that miracles too wear tattered clothes and carry plastic bags. Months later, Pedro had a dream. In it, the man from the bench appeared surrounded by a gentle light, his disheveled hair glowing and his eyes, once weary, now looked infinite. The man called him by name and said, "You asked for a gift, and you received it." Pedro, moved, tried to apologize for his arrogance, but was interrupted by a smile. "I didn't come to shame you, Pedro. I came to remind you. A heart that seeks with sincerity will always be answered." When he awoke, the tears came again, this time accompanied by a peace he had never felt before. It hadn't just been a dream, it was a confirmation. Pedro had been touched by something greater, and that something could not be contained in words or explanations, but blossomed in gestures, in choices, in silence. With time, Pedro founded a non-profit dedicated to welcoming people living on the streets. There, beyond offering shelter and food, he organized gatherings where stories were shared without judgment. In every speech he gave, he shared his own journey, not as someone teaching, but as someone bearing witness. His words were simple, yet carried the weight of true transformation. Without even noticing, he became a symbol of change. And though his car still sat in the garage and his house remained the same, Pedro was no longer the same man. He had learned that the true gift wasn't wrapped in ribbons. It was the courage to strip away his certainties and make room for what he had never been able to name before: the presence of God.